Aloan had cleaned the Alpha King's study every dawn for 3 years, and in 3 years the man had never once looked at her. That was the whole point of a good maid. You were meant to move through a room like weather through an empty field, leaving it changed, the dust gone, the fire lit, and no trace of yourself behind. She had gotten so skilled at not being seen that some mornings she wondered if she still had edges at all, or if she had simply worn down into something the great house looked straight through, which was exactly why the note in her apron pocket made no sense. It was the seventh one. She knew because she had kept every single one folded into a tin that had once held cough lozenges, hidden beneath the loose board under her cot in the servants' undercroft. 7 scraps of paper, each appearing where only she would find them, pressed inside the linen she was sent to fold, tucked beneath the inkwell she was told to clean, slid into the seam of the curtain she alone drew back at first light. 7 times she had unfolded a bit of paper, expecting a laundry list or a discarded draft, and 7 times she had read something that stopped the breath in her throat. This morning's was the shortest yet. She had found it weighted under a paperweight of black glass, and she had read it 4 times already, and she read it again now, because she could not help herself. I find you in the rooms. No one else does. You think you are invisible. You are the only thing in this whole gray keep that I can see. No signature. There never was. Just that same broad, unhurried hand, the letters leaning into each other, like men leaning into a wind. Warm and certain, and utterly dangerously kind. She had told herself every lie she could reach for. It was a cruel prank by one of the upper footmen. It was a trap laid by the steward to catch a thieving servant reading her betters' correspondence. She had believed each lie for about an hour, and then discarded it, because none of them explained the thing she could not say aloud, even inside her own skull. The hand on the paper was the king's. She had seen it 100 times on the edicts pinned in the great hall, on the ledgers she dusted, on the orders that sent men to the border and back. Except the king's true hand was narrow and severe, every letter standing at attention, like a soldier who expected to be struck. This hand was the same, and not the same. The same slant, the same way he crossed his 7s, but loosened somehow as if a fist had opened, as if someone had taken the king's writing and taught it to breathe. Eloan was still standing there, note in hand when the door opened. It should not have opened. King Emmerich Voss did not walk the halls at dawn. The whole rhythm of the keep was built around his absence at this hour. That was why she cleaned now, so that the terrible weight of him would never fall across her small and careful morning. But there he was, filling the doorway the way a storm fills a window, and behind him his beta, Rennick, and behind Rennick a guard whose face went the particular blank of a man who has decided he saw nothing. The king stopped. Eloan had heard him called many things. The Winter Alpha, the king who never wanted. It was said he had not raised his voice in 9 years, had not laughed in longer, had not looked at a woman with anything but the flat assessment. He gave a map. Standing 5 feet from him now, close enough to see the frost gray of his eyes and the hard hinge of his jaw, she believed all of it. He looked like something the winter had made on purpose and forgotten to give a heart. His gaze dropped to the paper in her hand. "Give me that," he said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man reaching for a document, and she surrendered the note before her mind had finished screaming at her not to. She watched him read it. She watched the exact moment the world came off its hinges. Because his face, that carved and careful face, changed. His thumb pressed the edge of the paper white. And when he looked up, it was not at her, but at his own hand, turning it over, staring at his own fingers as though they belonged to a stranger who had done something unforgivable while he slept. "Where did you get this?" he said. It was not a question, it was barely a breath. "It was under the paperweight, Your Majesty." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was a small mercy. "I clean here every morning." I wasn't. I would never take anything. This is my hand, he said. And now he was looking at her, and the flat winter of him had cracked, and what showed underneath was so raw she almost looked away out of decency. This is my writing. I did not write this. Behind him, Rennick had gone very still. The guard had achieved a kind of religious blankness. I don't understand, Eloin whispered, which was true, and also the most honest thing anyone had said in that room in years. For one long moment the Alpha King of Velmarch, the man who never wanted, who had not looked at her in 3 years of dawns, looked at a nobody chambermaid as though she were the single, most important and most frightening thing he had ever seen. His jaw worked. Something in his throat that was not quite a word tried to come up and was forced back down. Then his composure slammed shut like a portcullis. "Rennick," he said, without turning. "The girl stays in the keep. She does not leave the grounds. She does not return to the Undercroft, and she does not clean this room. Again, sire, see to it." He crossed the room in 3 strides, the note still crushed in his fist. And at the door he paused. He did not look back at her. She would think about that later. How he stood with his broad shoulders squared against her, as if the sight of her cost him something he could not afford. "How long," he said quietly, "how long have you been finding these?" Aloin's mouth had gone dry as ash. "6 weeks, your majesty. This is the 7th. The breath went out of him. She heard it. And then he was gone, and the door shut, and she stood alone in the king's study, with her heart slamming against her ribs, like a bird against a shuttered window, understanding only 2 things, with any certainty. The king had been writing her love letters in his sleep, and the king had no idea he'd been doing it. They put her in a room she was not remotely grand enough for. It was on the 3rd floor, where the household officers slept, a narrow chamber with a real bed, a window that opened, and a lock on the inside of the door, which Eloin found she could not stop touching, as though at any moment someone would come and explain the mistake and send her back down to the Undercroft where she belonged. A guard stood in the corridor. She did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the too-soft bed, with her tin of notes in her lap. She'd been permitted to fetch nothing, but she'd had the 7 folded into her apron since the moment the household had gone strange around her, and no one had thought to search a chambermaid, and she read them in order first to last. It did not. "I would know you in the dark by the sound of your breathing," said the 3rd. "You laughed in the scullery yesterday, and I felt it in my chest." "3 floors up," said the 5th, which was impossible, and which she had read so many times the crease had gone soft as cloth. They were not the notes of a man playing a cruel game. They were the notes of someone drowning who had found, at the bottom of all that water, one clear and steady light. But the king did not write them. He had said so himself, with his own face falling apart in front of her. "This is my hand. I did not write this." A man did not lie in the shape his face had made. Then who moved his hand? The question followed her into a thin and broken half-sleep, and was still sitting on her chest when the knock came, gentle and precise. Not a guard's knock. She knew before she opened the door that it would be Rennick, and it was. The beta, tall and narrow and gray at the temples, with the tired eyes of a man who has spent the better part of a decade standing between his king and the truth. "Miss Eloin," he said, "may I come in?" She stepped back to let him. He did not sit. He stood by the window with his hands folded behind him and looked out at the gray courtyard below, and for a while he said nothing at all, and Eloin, who had learned long ago that servants who filled silences got beaten for it, waited. "You've told no one," he said finally. It was not quite a question. "There's no one to tell, my lord." Something in the set of his shoulders eased a fraction. "That," he said, "is the first piece of good fortune this house has had in some time." He turned. "How much do you understand of what happened this morning?" "None of it," she said honestly. "He said it was his hand. He said he didn't write it. Both of those things can't be true, and both of them are. And I've been sitting here for 6 hours, trying to make that into sense, And I can't. To her surprise, the corner of Rennick's mouth moved. It was not a smile. It was the ghost of one. The memory of the muscle. No, he said. You can't. Not yet. He studied her with those tired eyes, and she had the uncomfortable sense of being weighed. Do you know what he is? What he truly is? An alpha. A shifter. She hesitated. They say his wolf died in the mountains. They say a great many things, Rennick said. Most of them, His Majesty encourages. He came away from the window and lowered his voice. Though there was no one to hear. I need you to understand that what I am about to ask of you is not a request I have any right to make. You are a chambermaid. You owe this house your labor and nothing else. And this house has given you a locked door and a guard and a great deal of fear in return. If you wish to have no part of it, say so now, and I will do everything in my power to see you safe and forgotten. Eloan's pulse was loud in her ears. And if I don't wish that? Rennick looked at her for a long moment. Then tonight, he said, I would like you to let us watch what happens when the king falls asleep. The words landed strangely, more intimate than they had any right to be, and heat climbed her neck before her mind caught up with it. My lord, I don't. That isn't. Not like that. Now he did almost smile, and it was kinder than she expected. You will not be alone with him. You will not touch him. You will sit in a chair across a very large room, in full view of myself and the healer, and you will do nothing at all. The near smile faded. For 6 weeks, 7 notes have appeared in rooms only you clean. In 3 years, nothing of the kind has ever happened to anyone else. Whatever this is, Miss Eloan, it is happening because of you. I would very much like to know why. Before it happens, somewhere I cannot control. Why would it matter where it happens? Rennick's face closed like a hand. That, he said, is the question I am trying not to answer until I'm certain. He moved to the door. Rest today. Eat something. Tonight a guard will bring you to the West Tower. After the household sleeps. He paused with his hand on the latch, and for the first time, the mask slipped. She saw how frightened he was. Underneath it, you seem a sensible girl. So, I will be honest with you, because I think you've earned it, and because I think you'll need it. My lord, whatever wrote those notes, Rennick said quietly. The king would tear this keep to the foundations before he let it near you. And I don't think he can stop it. He opened the door. Sleep, if you can. You won't much like tonight. He left before she could ask what he meant, and Eloan sat back down on the enormous bed with her tin of impossible letters, and did not sleep at all. The West Tower room was round and cold and almost entirely empty, and Eloan understood at once that it had been chosen for exactly those qualities. There was nowhere in it to hide. A single great chair by the cold hearth, a desk, a daybed against the curved wall, its blanket plain as a soldier's, and a chair, set far, far across the room from all of it. Her chair, she realized, positioned so that the whole floor lay between her and the king like a moat. He was already there when they brought her up. He stood at the arrow-slit window, with his back to the door, and he did not turn when she entered. And the line of his shoulders was so rigid, it looked painful. Your Majesty, Rennick murmured. She's here. I know. The king still did not turn. Sit her down. Get it over with. The healer was a woman, Eloan had seen only from a distance, Mistress Verena, who kept the still room and the household's older secrets. A wide, plain, unhurried woman, with iron-gray hair scraped back hard from her face, and hands stained brown from a lifetime of tinctures. She guided Eloan to the far chair with a grip that was gentler than it looked. Just breathe, girl, she said under her breath. You're not the one on trial tonight, which was not as comforting as she seemed to think it was. Then it began, and the strangeness of it was that nothing happened for a very long time. The king lay down on the daybed fully clothed, boots and all, and stared at the ceiling. Rennick sat by the door. Verena took the great chair by the dead hearth and folded her stained hands in her lap. and Eloin sat in her moat-ringed chair and looked at her own knees and tried not to exist, which was a skill she had at least. And the minutes went by like slow water. She could hear him breathing. That was the first thing. Deep, deliberate, forced. The breathing of a man holding himself under by main strength, the way you'd hold a struggling animal beneath the surface of a trough. She understood, listening to it, that King Emeric Voss was fighting sleep the way other men fought for their lives. He lost. It was not gentle. His breathing changed all at once, not softening, but dropping, falling off a cliff edge into something slow and heavy, and the tension went out of his hands where they lay at his sides, and Eloin heard Verena sit forward with the smallest creak of the chair. For a moment he simply slept, and even from across the room, Eloin could see how the sleep changed him. The hard hinge of his jaw loosened. He looked younger. He looked, she thought, with a lurch of something she had no business feeling, unbearably tired. The way a thing looks tired only when it has finally stopped pretending not to be. Then his hand moved. It moved wrong. That was the only way she could think of it afterward. It moved with a smoothness that had nothing sleeping about it, sliding across the blanket to the edge of the daybed and reaching, with perfect unhurried certainty, for the desk beside it. For the pen, for the paper Rennick had left there, she realized on purpose. Bait, laid out like a trap for a fox. Steady, Verena breathed. Nobody move. The king's eyes did not open. His face stayed slack with sleep. But his hand took up the pen and dipped it and began to write, and the way it moved was nothing like a sleeping man's fumbling. It moved like a craftsman's hand, like a thing that had done this 100 times in the dark and knew precisely what it was about. And as it wrote, the king's head turned, slow and deliberate, across the pillow, toward her. His eyes opened. Eloin's whole body went cold. Because they were his eyes, and they were not. The frost gray she'd seen that morning had gone dark, blown wide and black at the center, and there was something looking out of them that was awake in a way the sleeping man was not. It found her across the whole width of the room, across the moat they'd built, and it knew her. There was nothing cruel in it. That was the terrible part. There was only a want, so old and so patient and so starved, that it made her eyes sting. The hand kept writing without once looking at the page. "Don't," Rennick said sharply to her. She realized because she'd started to rise without deciding to. "Don't move toward him, whatever you do." She sat back down. The dark eyes tracked her the whole way, mild and certain, and the mouth, the king's stern, unsmiling mouth, curved, just slightly, into something that was almost tender, and entirely not the king's. Then the pen stopped. The head lowered back to the pillow. The eyes fell shut, and whatever had been awake behind them went under again, like a stone dropped into a well, and the room was only a room, with a sleeping man in it and 3 terrified people holding their breath. Verena crossed to the desk on silent feet and lifted the page and read it, and Eloin watched the color leave the healer's plain, unshakable face. "What does it say?" Rennick whispered. Verena did not answer him. She turned the page around so that Eloin, and only Eloin, could see it across the room. The broad, unhurried hand, the letters leaning into their wind. "I know they've locked you upstairs to keep you from me. Be patient. He is stubborn, but he is only a man, and he cannot hold the door shut forever. I have waited 9 years to want something. I will not lose you now. Gods keep us," Verena said softly, and for the first time all night she sounded afraid. "It isn't a spell. It isn't a curse." She looked at the sleeping king as though he were a wall behind which something enormous was pacing. "There are 2 of them in there, and the one we don't let out has finally found a reason to come through. They did not send Eloin back to her locked room." Verena took her instead down the winding stair to the still room, a low, warm cave of a place hung with drying bundles and shelved with brown glass, and she put a cup of something bitter and hot into Eloin's hands and sat her on a stool by the banked fire, and shut the heavy door and stood with her back against it as if to keep the night out. "Drink," she said. "You've had a fright, and you're no good to anyone in a faint." Eloan drank. It tasted of valerian and something darker underneath, and it steadied the shaking in her hands if not the shaking underneath it. "Mistress Verena," she said carefully. "What did you mean?" "Two of them." Verena was quiet for a moment, weighing something. Then she pulled a second stool close and sat, knee to knee, and lowered her voice as though the walls themselves reported to the crown. "What I tell you now leaves this room or it costs us both our heads," she said. "The king doesn't know I know. Rennick does no one else living." She waited until Eloan nodded. "You know an alpha is two things in one skin. The man and the wolf. In most, they live easy together. Two hands of the one body, the man for thinking and the wolf for feeling, and neither the master of the other. That's how it's meant to be." Her jaw tightened. 9 years ago, His Majesty broke that. Broke it how? On purpose. Verena said it flatly, but there was old grief under it. "There was a night in the border mountains I'll not tell you the whole of, because it isn't mine to tell, and because you don't need the weight of it. It's enough to say the king lost someone he loved more than his own life, and his wolf, grieving, half mad with it, did a thing that could not be undone, and Emmerich decided the wolf was to blame. He chained it, silenced it, shut it up in the dark of himself, and threw away the speaking of its name, and swore he would never let it choose, or want, or lead, again." She spread her stained hands. 9 years! 9 years he's been half a man on purpose, because he decided the wolf half didn't deserve to live above the surface. That's your winter alpha, not a man whose wolf died. A man who buried his wolf alive and has been standing on the grave ever since. Eloan's chest ached in a way she didn't have permission to feel, and now it's writing me letters. Now it's waking. A wolf can be chained a long time, but it can't be killed while the man lives. They die together or not at all, and a chained thing doesn't stop being hungry. It only gets more so. She looked at Eloan steadily. 6 weeks ago, it found a crack. Found you. For reasons I don't yet understand, you're the thing it decided was worth clawing to the surface for, and every night the man sleeps and loosens his grip, the wolf comes up through the gap and writes you what the man won't let himself feel awake. But why me? It came out smaller than she meant. I'm a maid. I'm a foundling. I don't even have a name that's properly mine. They gave it me off a list. King's wolves don't choose girls like me. Nobody chooses girls like me. She heard how bare that sounded only after she'd said it, and flushed. "I only mean it's a mistake. It has to be." Verena's expression did something complicated and sad. "Child," she said, "the wolf is the truest part of a man. It doesn't make mistakes about who it wants. It only makes them about how to have them." She sat back. "No, the mistake isn't the wolf choosing you. The mistake is a decade old, and it's this. A thing you cage doesn't come back the way it went in. It comes back starving and cracked, and it doesn't know its own strength, and it will do anything to reach what it wants." Her voice dropped. "Tonight, it wrote you a love letter, through a sleeping man's hand. That's tender enough now. But it's getting stronger, and the man is getting weaker, holding it down, and the two of them can't go on much longer at war in the one body without—" She stopped. "Without what?" Eloan whispered. "Without one of them breaking," Verena said. "A man split against himself this hard, for this long it tears. The healers have a word for it, that I won't frighten you with. What it means is this. If the king goes on chaining a wolf that's fighting to reach you, and the wolf goes on tearing at a man who won't let it, then, inside of a season, maybe 2, there won't be a King Emmerich Voss to argue with at all. There'll just be whatever's left when a man rips down the middle." The bitter cup had gone cold in Eloan's hands. Somewhere above them, 3 floors up, the most dangerous man in Velmarch was asleep, for the first time in longer than he could bear to count, dreaming letters he would wake and disavow. "There's more," Verena said, and something in her voice made Eloan look up. "And you'll like it less." "How could I possibly like anything less than that?" The old healer reached out and very gently turned Eloan's wrist over to the thin skin of the inside, where a faint mark had risen sometime in the night without her noticing. Pale silver, curved, unmistakable once you knew to look. Verena pressed her thumb to it, and Eloan gasped, because the touch rang through her like a struck bell, straight to somewhere behind her breastbone she hadn't known was there. "The wolf hasn't only been choosing you," Verena said quietly. "It's been binding you a little more. Each night you slept downstairs and dreamed of a hand you couldn't see." She let the wrist go, "which means whatever happens to him now happens to you, too. If he tears, girl, you tear with him." She rose and banked the fire lower, and her face in the dying light was grim and kind at once. "So now you know all of it, and now you have a choice no maid should ever have to make. And I'll not pretend otherwise." "What choice?" "Run," said Verena. "Or save him." She went to the door, but decide quickly. "Because the king has just sent word down that iron stair that he wants to see you at first light, and I have never once, in all my years in this house, known that man to willingly be in a room with the thing his wolf wants." They brought her up at first light, and Eloan climbed the iron stair on legs that did not want to carry her, and the silver mark on the inside of her wrist ached the whole way with a low, sweet pull, like a string tied to somewhere behind her ribs and drawn taut. The king received her in a small stone room off the tower, spare as a monk's cell, a table, 2 chairs, a window full of grey morning. He stood behind the table, its width between them like a man who had learned furniture could be armor. He had not slept since the West Tower. She could see it in the bruised hollows beneath his eyes, but the ice had gone back over him. The winter Alpha looked at her the way he looked at a map, measuring distances, planning a retreat. "I've arranged for you to leave," he said, without greeting. "There is a holding on the coast, 3 days' ride, quiet and warm, and far from all of this. You'll go as a free woman, not a servant. Money enough that you needn't work again if you don't wish to. Papers under whatever name you like." He said it evenly, reasonably, and only the fact that he could not quite hold her gaze gave him away. "You'll choose your own name. A foundling should have that much. It seems the least I owe you for 6 weeks of my trespass." For one traitorous heartbeat, Eloan wanted it so badly her mouth watered. A name of her own. A warm room by the sea that no one could send her down from, a life in which the great house looked straight through her forever, which was the only kind of safety she had ever known. "No," she heard herself say. Behind her, Rennick made a small sound of relief. The king's jaw hardened. "It wasn't an offer," he said quietly. "It's a mercy. Take it. With respect, your majesty, it's neither." Her voice shook, but the words kept coming, which surprised her as much as anyone. "Mistress Verena says the mark binds us. She says if you tear, I tear with you. And that sending me 3 days off won't cut the string. It'll only stretch it till it does the cutting for you. She says, the further you push me, the harder the thing in you claws to follow, and that clawing is what's killing you." She lifted her wrist, and the silver curve caught the gray light. "You can send me to the coast, sire. But I don't think either of us will like what's left of you by midwinter." The room went very still. "Is that true?" the king said. He did not look at her. He looked at Verena, and his voice had dropped to something dangerous. "Every word," said the healer, unafraid. "You've spent the best part of a decade believing the cure for a starving thing is to starve it harder. It isn't. It never was. The girl stays near, or the girl attends your funeral, and not by much." Eloan watched the king absorb this the way a wall absorbs a battering ram, not moving, and coming apart on the inside. His hands flattened on the table. When he finally spoke, the ice had a crack straight through it. "You don't know what it is you're asking to stay near," he said, low. "You've seen it write pretty words through a sleeping hand. You have not seen what it does when it's fully loose. I have held what it can do. And the last person who stood close to me believing that thing was safe." He stopped himself so hard she heard his teeth click. "Died," Eloan finished softly. "Yes," Mistress Verena said. She didn't say who. No, the king said. She wouldn't have. The silence stretched. And because Aloan had spent her whole life terrified of silences, and because she was very tired and very frightened, and had, apparently, misplaced her good sense somewhere on the iron stair, she said the first true thing that came to her. I'm not very good at sitting still and being useless. You know, it came out too fast, whatever this arrangement is. I've been useful since I was old enough to hold a rag. It's the only thing that's ever made me worth keeping. So if the plan is for me to sit in a cold tower every night doing precisely nothing while a king sleeps, I should warn you I'll be dreadful at it. I fidget, I talk. I'll almost certainly tidy something. Rennick made a strangled noise into his fist. And the king, the winter alpha, the man who had not laughed in longer than she'd been alive, looked at her with an expression she could not read at all, something caught between exasperation and a feeling much worse, and said, "Then you'll be perfectly suited to it. The tower is filthy, a beat. Every night, after the household sleeps, Verena stays in the room. Rennick, within call. You do not touch me. You do not answer the notes. And if I wake and tell you to run, you run, and you do not look back, and you do not ask why." His gray eyes finally met hers and held. "Those are the terms. Break them and I'll put you on the coast road myself. Bound if I have to." "I understand," Aloan said. She did not understand, but she was learning that this, too, was a kind of usefulness. Verena caught her sleeve on the way out and pressed something into her palm. A sprig of dried heartsease. Of all things, the little three-faced flower, gone papery with age. "For your pocket," the old woman murmured. "Won't do a thing. But my own mother gave me one. The first time I walked into a room I was frightened of, and I've not gone into one without since." Aloan closed her fingers around it. It was the first thing anyone in that keep had ever given her that was not an order or a wage, and she did not trust her voice enough to say so. That night, she sat in the tower, closer than before, the moat of empty floor halved on Verena's instruction, and she watched him fight sleep and lose it, and she waited for the pen and the paper. The wolf did not reach for the pen. The sleeping king's head turned toward her, the black rising up under his lashes, and then, slowly, terribly, with the drowsy certainty of a thing coming home, he rose from the daybed, he crossed the room. He walked to her through the dark with his eyes half open, and starved and tender, and Aloan's whole body locked, and Verena hissed. Rennick, and the beta was already moving, and the sleeping man reached out one hand and closed it around her marked wrist as gently as if he'd cradled it 1,000 times. The mark flared. White hot, Aloan gasped, and the king's eyes snapped open onto full frost gray horror, wide awake, his own hand on her skin, and he wrenched backward with a sound she would hear for the rest of her life. Not a snarl, not a shout, but a low broken thing, the sound of a man discovering exactly how little of himself he still held the reins of. "Get her out," he said hoarsely, "now." But they did not send her away, because sending her away was the one thing that made it worse, and so a strange life began. It went like this. In the daylight hours, Aloan did not exist to the king, and the king did not exist to her. She was given light duties in the still room under Verena, and moved through the keep as invisibly as ever. And if the great house looked through her, she found it no longer stung quite the way it had, because she carried a secret now. And a secret gives even an invisible girl a shape. Then, each night, after the keep had gone dark and quiet, a guard brought her up the iron stair to the cold round room, and she sat in her chair, closer every few nights by Verena's careful measure, and she watched a king teach himself to sleep. He did not thank her for it. He barely spoke. He would come in already, braced, lie down without a word, and set his jaw against the coming dark like a man wading into a cold river. But she noticed things, because noticing was what she was for. She noticed that the daybed had been made up with a proper feather pillow now, and that a second one had appeared, unremarked, on the arm of her chair. She noticed that the great hearth, dead the first night, was laid and lit before she arrived. She noticed that on the fourth night there was a pot of tea on the little table by her elbow, still warm, and no one would admit to having put it there, and the king stared at the ceiling with the tips of his ears gone faintly, furiously red. "Thank you for the tea," she said into the dark. "There is no tea," said the king. "Of course, my mistake." She heard him breathe out slow, and she chose, generously, not to name the sound as almost a laugh. The silence, she decided, was the enemy, not because it frightened her anymore, but because it gave the man too much room to fight himself in. So she began, without quite deciding to talk. Not about anything. She told him about the second undercook, who was conducting a doomed romance with a fishmonger, and thought no one knew. She told him about the keep's oldest cat, a one-eyed tyrant named Pudding, who ruled the kitchens by terror and had once held the entire pastry staff hostage over a dropped kipper. He never answered. He would go under mid-sentence now that she was near. The tearing eased, the wolf quieted, the way Verena had promised, and in the morning she would think he'd heard none of it. Then, on the 9th night, as he settled, he said to the ceiling, "The fishmonger. Does she know he's married?" Aloan sat up. "You were listening." "You are extraordinarily difficult not to listen to," the king said, with the air of a man lodging a formal complaint. "It's a defect in you. I'm merely a victim of it." He was quiet a moment. She should end it. "He'll break her heart and keep his boat." "That's very bleak, Your Majesty." "It's very true. They're often the same thing." But his voice had gone softer at the edges, and in the firelight the hard line of him had eased, and Aloan felt something in her own chest do a slow and dangerous turn, because it was such a small thing, a man remembering a story about a fishmonger, and it undid her more than any note had. They talked, after that, in pieces, in the dark. He asked her once, gruffly, staring at the ceiling, what name she'd have chosen if she'd taken the coast and the papers. She had to think a long time. "I don't know," she admitted. "I never let myself get as far as choosing. Choosing's for people who get to keep things." He didn't answer that for so long she thought he'd gone under. Then, very low, "Aloan was on a list, but you kept it. That's a kind of choosing." She had no reply that wouldn't have embarrassed them both. Some nights he was the one who asked, and she was never ready for it. Whether the other maids were kind to her, whether she had ever been truly hungry, the hollowing kind. Whether anyone had ever come looking, in all those years, for the babe left on the keep step in a market basket. She answered honestly, because lying in the dark to a half-sleeping king seemed a great deal of effort for very little return, and each honest answer seemed to cost him something, as though he were adding her small old hurts to a ledger he already had no coin to pay. Once, when she said lightly that a foundling learns early not to want things, so that nothing can ever be taken, she heard the mattress shift, and felt him turn toward her in the dark. "That is the worst thing anyone has said to me in 9 years, he said, rough and low. "And I have sat through confessions of murder." Then he turned back to the ceiling, and said nothing more. And she lay awake a long while, wondering what nerve she'd struck, and why it had sounded less like pity than recognition. She learned the shape of his walls without ever seeing over them. There was a room on the tower's lower floor he never opened and never mentioned, and once she caught him standing outside its door with his hand flat against the wood and his eyes shut, and he did not hear her, and she went away quietly and told no one. There was a name he never said. There was a wolf he never named, and there were still the notes, for the wolf had not stopped writing, only changed what it wrote. Verena kept them now in a locked box, and she showed Aloan, the newest one, on the 12th night, with a grave face. "He's letting me closer, because it keeps him alive, and he tells himself that's all it is. You know it isn't. But you should be afraid, little light, not of me, of what he'll do when he finally understands he can't have you without letting me up, and can't let me up without remembering what I cost him. He would rather die buried than dig me out. Be ready for that. Be ready to be the thing he throws away to save you. Eloan read it 3 times. It's warning me about him, she said slowly. The wolf is warning me about the man. They're the same soul, child, Verena said. When one half warns you off the other, it's not a quarrel. It's a confession. She folded the note away. Rest here tonight, by the fire. You're gray with tiredness, and the closer you sleep to him, the deeper he goes. Doctor's orders. So Eloin curled into the cushioned chair by the warm hearth, closer to the sleeping king than she had ever been permitted, and she watched his breathing go long and even and untroubled, and she thought, just before her own eyes betrayed her, he looks like a man who's put something heavy down. Then the fire was gone. The warmth was gone, and she was standing ankle-deep in snow inside a hall she had never seen, under a sky the color of an old scar, and somewhere close by, muffled by all that white, she could hear the slow, patient dragging of a chain. It was the great hall. She knew it, and didn't. The same vaulting stone, the same long-tabled length of it, the same high windows, but drowned. Snow lay thick over the tables, and the fallen banners, and heaped in the great cold hearth where no fire had burned in years. Frost had climbed the pillars and fanned across the windows, in ferns of white. The whole enormous room stood silent and ruined and waiting, and the snow was falling upward, she realized, drifting slow toward the dark rafters, like something being unmade, and there was no cold in it. It should have frozen her through. Instead, it felt like standing inside a held breath. This is where he goes, she understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof. This is the place under the sleep. This is the grave he stands on. The dragging of the chain came again from the far end of the hall, and Eloan went toward it, because there was nothing in her that could have gone the other way. She found him at the center of the ruin. The king, or the dream of him, barefoot in the snow, no crown, no armor, just a man in a plain shirt with his back to her and his shoulders squared against something behind him, standing sentry over the thing he would not turn to look at. And behind him, chained, was the wolf. It was enormous, and it was starving. She saw the great ribs standing under a coat, the gray of wood smoke and old iron, saw the scars seamed white across its flank, saw the black manacles of frost that pinned each leg to the stone floor of the hall, and the greater chain that ran from its throat down into the snow, and she understood without seeing, down into the earth beneath, anchored in something buried, and it lifted its huge head as she came, and its eyes were the blown black she knew, and they found her across all that white, and lit, and the starved patient want in them broke her open where she stood. I find you in the rooms no one else does, the eyes said, without a sound. Even this one. Especially this one. She came closer, close enough to see that the frost manacles had worn the fur from its legs, down to raw skin. Close enough to see that the great chain at its throat was not iron at all, but something darker. Braided, she somehow knew, out of every word the man had refused to say in all that time, thick as her arm, and cold as the space between stars. The wolf did not lunge, it did not show its teeth. It only watched her come with that unbearable patience, and then lowered itself flat into the snow to make itself smaller, lesser, safer. A starving giant folding down, so as not to frighten the single thing it had waited so very long to see. And that undid her more than teeth would have. Whatever she had braced herself to meet in the monster the king had buried, it had not been this. Not courtesy. Not a creature so desperate to be gentle that it lay down in its own chains. "Don't," said the king, without turning. His voice came flat and exhausted through the falling snow. "Don't go to it. You don't know what it is." "I think I do," Eloan said. Her own voice came out small in that vastness. I think it's the part of you that writes me letters. I think it's the part of you that remembers how to want things. She took a step toward the wolf, and the king's dream self flinched as if struck, and still he would not turn to face either of them. Why won't you look at it? Because if I look at it, I'll want to let it up. He said it so quietly, she almost lost it, under the snow. And the last time I let it up, his hands closed into fists at his sides. Somewhere down in the buried chain, something shifted, and a fine crack raced up the nearest pillar with a sound like a bone giving way, and a slab of frost sheared off the ceiling and vanished into the upward snow. "The hall is falling," Eloin said, alarmed. "The hall is always falling." The king finally turned, and his dream face was not the winter alphas at all. It was raw and young and grieving, stripped of a decade of ice. "It's been falling since the night I chained him. A man can't cage half his own soul and expect the house to stand. It comes down a stone a season." He looked at her with something close to pleading. "That's what you're bound to now. That's what your pretty silver mark ties you to. Not to me. To this. To a hall that's coming down on top of a grave I dug myself." His voice cracked. "Go back up. Wake. I never should have let you sleep this close." But Eloin had stopped listening, because the wolf had lowered its great head to the snow, to the place where the chain went down into the earth, and it had begun, very softly, to keen. And in the keening was a name, worn smooth as a river stone, from being carried too long unspoken, and Eloin heard it, clear as a bell across the ruined hall. "Selah," the wolf grieved. "Selah, Selah." The king made a sound like he'd been run through. The keening rose, and for one moment Eloin felt the whole shape of the grief, not through her eyes, but through the mark on her wrist, which had gone burning cold, a wave of loss, so total it drove the air from her dream lungs. It was older than the hall, and older than the ice, the grief of a creature that had loved something with its entire animal heart and been told the loving was to blame for the losing, and the snow stopped falling, all of it. It hung motionless in the vast cold air, every flake suspended and every black eye in that hall, the wolf's, the man's, turned to Eloin as though she had done something enormous simply by hearing, and the buried chain went taut with a deep groaning shudder that ran up through the soles of her feet, and the whole frozen hall leaned and began slowly to fall inward toward the two of them and the grave between. Eloin woke with a cry, upright in the chair, the fire snapping cheerfully beside her. The king was awake. He was sitting on the edge of the daybed with his face in his hands, and he was shaking, and when he lowered his hands and looked at her across the warm little room, his frost-gray eyes were wet and wide and absolutely terrified, and she understood that he had been there too, that he had seen her in his hall, that the one place he had let no living soul go. She had just walked straight into. "You were there," he whispered. "You heard her name." He stood unsteady, backing away from her toward the door as though she had become the dangerous one. "No one goes down there. No one is supposed to be able to." His voice failed. "You have to leave. Not the tower, the keep, everything. Tonight." His back hit the door. "Because you've just shown me the one thing I can't survive, Eloin. You've shown me there's a way to lose you too." He sent her out of the tower that same hour, and this time there was no arrangement to soften it. She was given rooms in the east wing, far from the tower, as the keep could put her, while the mark still made true distance, a kind of dying. And she was told, courteously, by a steward, who would not meet her eyes, that the maid was to want for nothing and go nowhere. No one said the word prisoner. No one had to. Comfort, it turned out, could be a cell if you locked the door kindly enough. The king did not come. Of course he didn't. She told herself she'd expected nothing else, and lay awake in a good bed hating how much of a lie that was. And then they both began to come apart. She felt it first as a wrongness under the breastbone, a hollow where the pull had been, as though someone had reached into her chest and taken out a warmth she hadn't known she'd grown to lean on. She stopped being able to finish meals. The silver mark on her wrist dulled from bright to ashen, and ached with a cold that no fire touched. Verena came twice a day with tinctures that did nothing, and a face that grew grimmer each visit, and on the third day, Eloin made her say it. He stopped sleeping again, the healer admitted. The moment you left the tower. The wolf's clawing at the door with you gone, and the man standing against it with everything he has left. And the everything he has left isn't much. She set down her useless cup. The hall's coming down faster, child. He's told the council. He has a fever, they half believe it. The other half, her mouth thinned. The other half have decided a fevered king with no heir needs a wife by spring, and they've a lady picked out. Corisand of the river houses. Highborn, biddable, entirely suitable. She looked at Eloin. They mean to marry him, to a stranger, to steady the crown, and it will kill him faster than the fever ever could, because you cannot make a man choose one thing, while the truest part of him has already chosen another. The wolf will not unchoose you for a treaty. It will only tear harder, trying to reach you through the wedding vows. Eloin sat with that. His wolf chose me, she said slowly, before he ever did, before he'd let himself. That's what all this is. That's exactly what all this is, said Verena. The beast is only ever honest. It's the man who lies to himself. Most of all, Eloin looked down at her own hands. They had gone thin in a week, the knuckles too sharp, the nails pale as candle tallow. When she'd been small and unwanted, she had made herself small enough to survive the unwanting. She had never once, in all those careful years, let herself need a single living soul, because need was only a longer word for a thing that could be taken away. And now she needed him, this impossible frozen man, needed him the way a lung needs air, and the needing was carving her hollow from the inside, and the truth she could not say aloud even to Verena was that she did not regret it. She would rather starve full of him than be safe and empty ever again. Then tell me the truth, he's lying about. Eloin's voice came out fiercer than she meant. Tell me about Selah. I heard the name in the hall. He grieved it like it was the last word he had. Who was she? Verena was quiet a long moment. Not yet, she said gently. That story isn't mine to give you cheap. And you'll need it whole, not in pieces, and you'll need to be standing in front of him when you get it. She rose. Rest. Eat if you can, because I don't think this holds much longer, and when it breaks, it'll break fast. It did not comfort her. She spent that day at the window of her comfortable cell, and once, only once, she saw him. The king crossing the grey courtyard between the tower and the mews with 2 guards a careful pace behind, and even at that distance, even after only a week, she could see what the tearing had done. The breadth of him gone gaunt. The sure stride turned to something braced and careful. He did not look up at her window. But she saw him falter mid-step and press a hand briefly to his chest, over the place where the bond lived, and she pressed her own hand to the same place, and felt faint, and far down the golden thread, the echo of him doing it. Then the guards closed around him, and he was gone. It broke, that night. Eloin was woken by the bell, not the slow toll of an hour but the hard, panicked clangor of alarm, and by shouting in the corridors, and by the mark on her wrist flaring suddenly, agonizingly alive, white fire lancing up her arm, so that she cried out and clutched it to her chest. Down the lengths of the keep, muffled through stone, she heard something that no human throat had made, a roar, enormous and broken, the sound of the thing in the frozen hall clawing its way up into the waking world at last. The door was locked. She beat on it. Let me out. Something's wrong. Let me out. The lock turned. Rennick stood in the corridor, and he had blood on his sleeve that was not his own, and his composure was entirely gone. He shifted, the beta said, in the middle of the great hall, in front of half the court. He didn't mean to. He can't stop it anymore. It's coming up whether he wills it or no. He put a man through a table, and nearly took my arm off before he forced it back down. And then he locked himself in the tower, and told me if anyone opens that door, he'll finish what he started. Rennick's voice cracked down the middle. I have served him 20 years. I have watched him hold a shift through a spear wound, and never so much as gasp. Tonight he could not hold it through a meeting. It came up through him like water through a cracked hull. Gray to the elbows, his voice split into two voices. And the look on his face while he forced it down was the worst thing I have seen in a life that has not been short of bad things. Because he was not fighting a battle rage, Eloin, he was fighting himself, and he is losing. I can hear two of him in there now. And you are the only living soul who has ever walked into the place where the other one lives. His eyes were wet and desperate and ashamed of the asking. He forbade me to bring you, so I'm not bringing you. I'm opening this door, and I'm going to go be very busy somewhere else. And what a maid does with an unlocked door in the night is no fault of mine. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Eloin was already past him, running for the tower on bare and freezing feet. The tower door was barred from the inside, and she pounded on it until her fists ached, and from within came only a low, wet, laboring sound, like a great animal breathing through a wound. Emeric. She pressed her forehead to the wood. It's me. Open the door. Go! His voice, when it came, was barely his. Thick, doubled. As though two throats spoke at once, and neither had quite the shape of words anymore. I told Rennick, go, before I. You can't be near me when it comes up. I'll not have that on. Not you. Not you. Two. 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 She said it softly, and the pounding of her heart went quiet, because there it was, the whole shape of him, in one small word. Not me. Two like Selah. Silence. Terrible and total. You think if you let it up, it'll take me the way it took her. Open the door and tell me. You said I'd need the story whole. And I'd need to be standing in front of you. Well, I'm in front of you. There's a door in the way, but that's the least of what's between us, isn't it? Open it. For a long moment, nothing. Then the bar scraped back, and the door swung inward, and Eloin stepped into the dark tower and saw what 9 years of lying to himself had made of a man. He was on the floor with his back against the daybed, and he was only half a man, his eyes gone fully black and wolf-wide, gray fur ghosting along his forearms, and receding and rising again as the two of him fought over the single body, his hands clawed and human by turns, his whole frame shuddering with the war of it. He looked up at her, and both of them were in his ruined face at once. The man's horror and the wolf's naked, starving relief. There she is, said the doubled voice, and for one word, the wolf had the tongue, and it was almost weeping. Then the man wrenched it back. Get out, he begged. Tell me about your sister, Eloin said, and sat down on the cold floor in front of him, close, inside the reach of those clawed and shaking hands, and did not flinch. While you still have the words, and because he was too far gone to armor himself, and because she had refused to be sent away one time too many, it came out of him in a flood. Selah had been 19. His only sister, sharp-tongued and fearless, who had ridden to the mountain campaign against every order because she would not sit safe at home while her brother bled at the border. The night of the ambush, the enemy had come through, the pickets in the dark, and Emeric had shifted to meet them, had let the wolf all the way up, to be the thing that stood between the pack and the dark. And the wolf had fought like a storm, given teeth. But there had been so many, and the dark had been so total, and somewhere in the churn of it, Selah had been unhorsed, and by the time the wolf tore through to where she'd fallen, it was already too late, and he had come back to himself with his sister's blood on his muzzle and no way on earth to know whether it was the enemy's doing or his own. Whether in that blind, killing fury the wolf had. He had held her body in the wreck of the dawn, he said, and the whole camp had gone silent around them, and someone, some well-meaning captain, had set a hand on his shoulder and said the thing that had lodged in him like a splinter for years. These are the costs of war, your majesty. No one blames you, as though blame were a thing other people handed out, as though he had not already passed a sentence on himself that no pardon could ever reach. You don't know, Eloan breathed. You never knew. Whether it was them or I couldn't tell. It came out of him shattered. 9 years and I still can't tell. And the not knowing is the whole of the curse, do you see? I chained it because I could not stand in the same skin as a thing that might have, and every night it goes down to her grave and grieves her, and I make it grieve alone, because if I go down there with it, I'll have to know. And I would rather die not knowing than learn I. Stop. Eloan took his terrible half-changed hands in both of hers, and the mark on her wrist blazed, and she did not let go. Listen to me, because I know something about being the thing that gets blamed for its own abandonment. I spent 20 years certain that if I'd been better somehow, less trouble, less hungry, less me, my mother would have kept me. I built my whole life around being useful, so no one would ever have cause to set me down again. And it was a lie, Emmerich. It was always a lie. I wasn't left because I was a thing that deserved leaving. I was just a baby in the cold, and the world is cruel, and none of it was ever a verdict on me. Her voice broke and she pushed through it. Your wolf didn't fail Selah, because your love is a weapon. It ran through the dark toward her, because it loved her. That's not the thing that killed her. That's the only thing in that whole night that was trying to save her. And you've spent all this time punishing it for grieving the hardest of anyone. You want to know the cruelest part? She went on, softer now. It's the same lie, yours and mine. You decided the part of you that loves is a danger, so you locked it away where it couldn't hurt anyone, and you called that penance. But it was never penance, Emmerich. It was just another way of refusing to be loved back. And I decided the very same thing about myself, that I'd be safer wanting nothing, needing no one, useful, and small and impossible to disappoint. We each built a whole life out of the belief that we didn't deserve the one thing we were quietly dying without. She pressed his clawed, shaking hands harder between hers. I'm done believing it. Be done with me. The wolf's black eyes were fixed on her, utterly still. I can't know that, he whispered. Then go down and find out, she said. Not alone with me, I've already been. I'm already bound to the fall of that hall, whether you like it or not. So let me be bound to what happens next in it too. She leaned her forehead against his, human, and wolf and all. You chose a stranger's treaty over the truth for the better part of a decade, because the truth might damn you. Choose the truth this time. Choose me. Awake and knowing, and all the way your wolf did 6 weeks ago, before you'd even let yourself look at me. His breathing shuddered. The fur receded. For one moment, the man came all the way back up into his own eyes, frost gray and streaming, and he looked at her the way she had wanted, her whole invisible life, to be looked at by anyone. I don't know how to want something and not lose it, he said. Nobody does, said Eloan. You want it anyway. That's the whole of the trick, and she kissed him. He went still against her mouth, as though he had forgotten a body could be met with tenderness instead of braced against a blow. And then, all at once, 9 years of held breath went out of him, and his arms came around her, and he kissed her back like a man who had been dying of thirst 3 feet from a well he'd forbidden himself to drink from. Eloan, her name, against her lips, rough and reverent. If we do this, the bond finishes. There's no half of it. It seals, and then there's no unbinding, not ever. And if I go down into that hall tomorrow, and I'm wrong about what I'll find there, then we'll be wrong together, she said. Instead of you being right and alone for 9 more years, I'll take the together. You should be certain. His hand came up to her face, still half clawed, gentling as she leaned into it. I'm not a kind man, Eloan. I don't know that I remember how. I'll have frostbitten edges you'll cut yourself on for the rest of your life, and a grave in me that will never quite close over. You'd be marrying a man and his ghost and his wolf. All three. And only two of us are any good company. I've spent my whole life being no one's, she said. Do you understand what that is? To have never once been chosen? Not by a mother? Not by a house? Not by a single soul? You move through the world so certain you're nobodies that you stop leaving footprints. Her voice shook, and she let it. Your wolf found me in the rooms. No one else looked in. He chose me before I was even worth the choosing. You could hand me every frostbitten edge and every ghost you own, and it would still be the warmest thing that ever happened to me. So yes, I'm certain. The last of the wolf's fur smoothed away under her hands. What was left was only him, the man, whole for the moment, warm and shaking, and hers. And when he lifted her, it was with none of the sleeping wolf's fumbling, but the sure, deliberate care of a man who had decided at last to hold something he meant to keep. There, in the dark of the tower, with her hands framing his face, and his brow bowed to hers, the last wall inside him came down. He lowered his mouth to the curve where her neck met her shoulder, and with a low sound torn out of the very root of him, set the mate mark there, sealing the bond his wolf had begun, weeks before, in the rooms she'd thought were empty. And she pressed her lips to the same place on him and marked him in, kind, claiming him as fiercely as she was claimed, so that neither of them could ever say afterward that he had been the only one who chose. The mark on her wrist did not ache any more. It glowed, steady and warm and gold, and she felt him at the other end of it, no longer a pull toward an absence, but a presence settled, their two souls, where there had been a wound. She lay with her ear over his heart, and felt, through the new-forged link, the strangest thing, not just the man's contentment, but the wolf's, beneath it, the two of them agreeing for once, agreeing about her. It was the first time she would understand, only later, that any part of Emmerich Voss had wanted the same thing as any other part of him. She had not healed him. She knew that even then. But she had given the two halves of him one thing they could both hold without fighting over it, and sometimes that is where a healing starts. Afterward he held her against his chest and did not let go, and felt the astonishing new fact of his contentment humming down the bond, like sun on water. He was quiet a long while. Then into her hair, in a voice she'd never heard him use. Young, wondering, wrecked open. I've read every word he wrote you, he said. The wolf. I remember them now, the way you remember a dream you had in someone else's bed. I find you in the rooms no one else does. His arms tightened. He was right. He was right about you. Before I'd let myself look, he's a better man than I've been. I've been the beast this whole time, Aloan, not him. You're the same soul, she murmured, half asleep, warm to the marrow for the first time in her life. When one half forgives the other, it isn't a mercy, it's a homecoming. She felt him smile against her hair. She felt him, at last, let go of the last thread of vigilance he'd held so long. She felt him fall, not the fought, clawing collapse of the tower nights, but true sleep, deep and unafraid, the sleep of a man who has finally set down a body he's been carrying too long. And because she was bound to him now, wholly and forever, she fell with him. She had time, in the last warm moment before the dark took her, for one clear and frightened thought, that the last time she'd gone down into that hall, it had been coming down on top of her, and that she was about to go back into it holding the hand of the man whose grave it was. With no idea whether love was enough to hold up a ceiling that a decade of penance had been bringing down, then the thought too was gone, and there was only the falling and his hand, and the cold coming up to meet them. The warm dark took her, and then the warm dark was cold and white and vast, and she was standing ankle-deep in snow inside the great frozen hall, and this time she was not alone in it, because his hand was in hers, and King Emmerich Voss had come down into his own grave awake, and beside them, Straining against its chains, the starving wolf lifted its enormous head and howled. The hall was worse than before. Whole pillars had come down, the high windows gaped, the ceiling sagged toward them under the weight of all that upward falling snow, and the deep chain that ran from the wolf's throat into the buried dark groaned like a ship breaking up on rocks. The fall had almost finished. There was, Elowen understood, very little hall left to lose. Emeric stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, staring at the wolf, and the wolf stared back. And 9 years stood between them like a wall of ice. "Go to him," Elowen said. "I don't know what I'll find." His voice shook. "If I look at what happened that night, if I let myself remember all the way down, I'll be holding your hand the whole time," she said. "Whatever's at the bottom, you won't be alone in it. That's the only thing that's different from every other night you've come here. Let it be enough." He crossed the snow. Each step cost him. The wolf watched him come with its whole starved attention, and it did not strain against the chains now, did not lunge or plead. It only waited, the way it had waited 9 years, the way it had waited 6 weeks. In the rooms Elowen cleaned, patient past all reason, hoping past all evidence, for the one thing it had never once been given, to be looked at by the man it shared a soul with, and not turned away from. Elowen felt Emeric's dread pour down the bond, vast and glacial, and beneath it, something she had not felt in him before, a thin, terrified thread of hope. And when he reached the great, chained beast, he did the one thing he had refused to do in all that time. He knelt, and he looked at it, and he said, "I'm sorry." The wolf shuddered. "I'm sorry I blamed you," Emeric said, and his voice broke and kept going. "I couldn't tell that night. I couldn't tell whose blood it was, and I was so afraid it was ours that I never once let myself look for the truth. I buried you, so I'd never have to know. And you've been down here grieving her the whole time, haven't you? You loved her more than I let myself. You've been mourning my sister for 9 years, while I stood up there in the light, pretending I didn't have a heart to break." And the wolf, in answer, turned its great head at last toward the buried chain, toward the grave beneath the snow, and it began to dig. Elowen held Emeric's hand as the snow gave way, as the wolf's huge paws bared not a body but a memory, laid out clear in the white, the night itself, unspooling. It came up out of the snow like breath fogging on cold glass, silent and complete. And then they were standing inside it, the mountain camp at the black hour before dawn, the picket fires guttering, and the enemy pouring out of the tree line with no war cry at all, which was somehow the worst of it. She felt Emeric flinch beside her as it played. She felt him try, from long and bitter habit, to look away, and she felt him, with everything he had left, make himself watch instead. Selah was there. 19, and furious, and magnificent, her sword already drawn, shouting her brother's name across the churn of it. And the wolf, enormous and gray, wheeling at the sound of her voice. It tore through a wall of enemies toward the fallen girl, and Elowen saw it now, and Emeric saw it, and the wolf beside them saw its own truth-born witness at last. It had gone to Selah, not in fury, but in frantic, desperate love, and the wound that killed her was already there. She had been struck as she fell, from the side, by a soldier the wolf had not yet reached. The blade went in, and the wolf arrived, one heartbeat, one single, unforgivable, entirely blameless heartbeat, too late. The blood on its muzzle was the blood of the enemies it had cut through, trying to reach her in time. "It wasn't you," Elowen whispered. "You were trying to save her, both of you." "It was never." Emeric made a sound she had no name for, and folded forward, and pressed his face into the great gray ruff of the wolf's neck. And for the first time in 9 years, the man and the beast grieved the same grief in the same body at the same time. No wall between them. Elowen felt it roll down the bond and into her own chest, and she wept with them, for a girl she had never met, and a wolf she had only just, and a man who had spent a decade convinced that the sheer size of his love was the measure of his crime. You loved her too much to forgive yourself for outliving her. That was the whole of it. That was the chain. Not guilt for a thing he had done. Guilt for a thing he had not been able to stop. Dressed up all these years as guilt for a thing he had, because the first was unbearable and the second at least could be punished. And the buried chain that had bound the wolf to that grave, braided out of every word he'd refused to say, simply, finally, loosened, and fell away into the snow, and was gone. The hall stopped falling. For one breathless moment, the whole ruined vastness hung suspended. And then, impossibly, it began to rise. The fallen pillars lifting, the shattered windows, knitting whole, the snow reversing its long unmaking, drifting down now instead of up, gentle and ordinary and clean. Not the frozen tomb it had been, just a great hall in winter, cold and beautiful and standing, with a fire beginning, small and gold, in the enormous hearth where none had burned in longer than the servants could remember. And the wolf, no longer starved, no longer scarred, its coat, the deep clean gray of wood smoke, rose to its full towering height, whole at last, and turned its black eyes on Eloin, and lowered its great head to her in something that was unmistakably a bow. Then it looked at Emmerich, and the man looked back at his wolf, without flinching, without blame, without the wall, and the two of them were, for the first time in nearly a decade, simply one thing, looking out through one pair of eyes. "Thank you," Emmerich said to himself. Gainer, the wolf's name. The name he had not spoken in 9 years. And saying it, he wept and smiled at once. "I'd forgotten your name. I'm sorry I won't again." And Gainer, named again after 9 years of silence, whole again after all the long ruin, pressed his great head once, briefly to the king's chest, over the heart, the way a wolf leans its whole weight into the one it has decided is home. Then he lifted his muzzle to the mended rafters of the hall and howled, and it was nothing at all like the broken sound of the nights before. It was a hunting song, a homecoming. The sound of a thing remembering it is alive. Eloin woke in his arms, in the warm dark of the tower, with dawn coming gray and ordinary through the arrow slit and a fire crackling in the hearth. Emmerich was already awake, watching her, and his frost-gray eyes were wet, and his face was open in a way she had never seen on the Winter Alpha and never would again, because the Winter Alpha was gone, thawed out entirely, and what was left was only a tired, grieving, mending man who had finally stopped standing guard on his own grave. He lifted her marked wrist to his lips. "I find you," he said, against the warm gold of it, wide awake, choosing it with the whole of himself for the first time. "In the rooms, no one else does." And this time, there was no wolf borrowing his sleeping hand to say it, and no dream to hide behind, and no wall, and no winter. Only the man, awake in the gray and ordinary dawn, saying the truest thing he knew, out loud and unafraid, and for good. The curse, if it had ever truly been a curse, and not just a man at war with himself, did not lift all at once. Emmerich still grieved, Selah was still gone, and forgiving the wolf had not brought her back. And some nights he still went down to the hall in his sleep to sit by her memory a while. But he did not go alone anymore, and he did not go blaming, and the hall did not fall. He would come up in the mornings quiet and red-eyed, and reach for Eloin, and she would hold him, and he would talk about his sister, her sharp tongue, her fearlessness, the way she'd have laughed herself sick to see her severe brother married to a chambermaid, until the talking got easier the way it does, so slowly you can't mark the day it changed. For it was a chambermaid he married. In the end, the council's carefully chosen Lady Coruscant was thanked, compensated, and sent home to her river houses with, it was rumored, a certain relief. The court did not know what to do with a foundling queen. The whispers followed Eloin down every corridor for a season, and she felt each one. But Americ's hand was steady in hers when they spoke the vows, and afterward he told her that any lord who objected was welcome to take it up with the king, who was, he said, unreasonably and permanently devoted to his queen. She kept the tin of 7 notes. She added the ones that came after, for he still wrote them, only now he wrote them awake, in a hand that had learned to breathe, and left them where only she would find them, under the black glass paperweight, in the seam of the curtain, tucked into the linen. She never told him she'd kept every one. She thought perhaps he knew. Now, months on, Eloan woke slowly to a room full of ordinary morning light. Emmerich slept beside her, deep and easy, one arm thrown across her waist, his face untroubled, no grave beneath him and no war within him, and no wall between the man and the wolf that had, all along, only ever been trying to love the people he loved. She watched him a while. This man, the whole realm had called the king who never wanted, sleeping like something that had finally been allowed to rest. Then she settled back against his shoulder, into the warm gold hum of the bond, and let her own eyes fall closed, and the 2 of them, the 3 of them, slept on, in the rooms where no one else could find them.